Hello, my name is Bryant Hunt. Today is the 27th day of June 2020, and my title of the talk tonight is How did the United States get into the situation it is in? Basically, I'm going to start at the beginning um, to do with the war, supposedly for independence against Britain, and what really took place. Um, and so we are told by our educational system that we are free people. If we're free, why are we still paying money to England? And what I mean by that simply is, why are we paying money since basically 1655 is what I understand. The United States is still paying every year, actually. Part of the Feast of All Saints Day on November 1st, and it started in 1665. I said 1655, I'm sorry, 1665. That there will be a fourth part of all gold and silver, or which with the limits aforesaid shall from time to time happen to be found. And this is based upon the Carolina Charter in 1663. So that was just give you a little smidge of what's going on. A lot of this stuff I get is from a guy named James Montgomery, who lived in the state of North Carolina, and so another gentleman named the Informer, who never shared his name, lived also in North Carolina, and both these guys actually went to their libraries. That is probably at University of North Carolina, and probably I'm guessing this at the law library, probably at the University of North Carolina, or the state library that holds all the documents for the state of North Carolina. And I want you to see how this happens, and little, like I call it, a puzzle, on how the United States has been eroding its so-called freedoms since day one. And first of all, if the United States had won the war, why are we still paying England this money? And it goes to the king, the royalty. And why at the treaty at Paris, and also the Jayth Treaty in 1783, I think, maybe 1787, I'm sorry, nothing changed. Nothing changed. And reality simply is that the king couldn't do anything because he's constrained by the Pope. That's right, the Pope. A lot of this goes back, and I want to do another deal with this, with the Magna Carta. We're all taught this, that's where it all started. That's where we got our freedoms. No, that's where we lost our freedoms. That is the country of England, and eventually the United States. So I want to explain another thing. I explained this to a friend the other day, and I want to explain it to you. When the United States came here, when the British came here to settle, they had this idea that the Indians were savages, and that according to the Catholic Church, that made them inferior, and that they could not own land. Well, the Indians never owned the land. They never even looked at it that way. Their perspective was simply as they were just good stewards of the land for those in the future. And if we understand that, they never spoiled the land. They never took more than what they had to have each day. They didn't. They just didn't do that. It's just not who they are. And they were close to nature. And one of the major things you need to understand, in a spiritual sense, is the Indians had feathers. that is from birds, eagles, I'm sure from hawks, and all of them had feathers. That is a sign, that is the air sign. That is the air sign in astrology. And it being cardinal, which is the highest of all the highs. So, with us taking place, and all these things took place, the United States had to pay France also back for them, for their war materials, for just what with the debt. I think it was close to $18 million. Don't hold me to that. That's my mind telling me. And we paid on that. I don't think people are aware that also Great Britain, England, hired German Hessen's troops to come here. Over 30,000 of them. That's a pretty large chunk. And at the end of the war, I think there was approximately 125 to 130,000 troops that were here from Britain, also from Germany, and also the Indians who helped out for supporting the British side. And the United States had approximately somewhere in the neighborhood of 90,000 troops. And that was mainly Americans, and that was actually 1,000, what I read, 1,000 black slaves who also fought. So, if this is true, and I believe it solely to be, when there was a major thing that took place after the United States becomes a country in southwest Pennsylvania, where a group of people decided they were going to make their own alcohol and sell it. And that was a major no-no, you see. Alexander Hamilton was highly influential upon policies, especially dealing with money and banking. Major. He was involved in that heavily. And no, that's not going to take place, because we're not going to allow you to sell moonshine, and we're going to have someone else to do it, and we're going to make money off of it by charging a tax on it in order for us to pay our bills to England and to France, mainly to France at that point. So there's enormous pressure taking place here with the American government already deeply in debt, supposedly free, and immediately when these people in southwest Pennsylvania are doing this, it didn't take long for Washington and approximately 10,000 troops to quell this rebellion. And we know also in the state of Massachusetts, there was a raid at the Arsenal, that is where the arms are kept at, to people who were angry because they were having to pay enormous taxes, and they were going to start another rebellion. And that was quelled. So there's two major red flags there that indicated that things were not so well after we so-called won the war. And most people were saying in school, well, they were just rebellious people, such and such. No. No, they had a legitimate reason. The first one was trying to basically to make some money. Yeah, which in reality, the money in America at that point was pretty much worthless. So that was a way of them trading or making money or getting gold and silver, which was real money, not the fiat currency we have today. So what transpired there, and they defeated this boat. The southwestern Pennsylvania people had simply scattered to the hills. When they heard word that they were coming, they took off. So that kind of quelled that also. But that tells you the idea of what's going on here, and what transpired after the war. And most people don't know that actually the British troops were still here approximately a year after the war was supposedly over with their arms. So it's a little thing that takes place that most people are not aware of. And this was introduced into Congress later on in the early 1800s. And it was the 13th Amendment. This has been hush-hush for, it's called the Missing 13th Amendment. You can look it up on the internet. And what transpired here was simply that before anybody got their feet solid to the ground, the members of the House and senators were forbade to have what we call lawyers, barristers. I don't know how to pronounce that in England. I'm trying to remember. But basically, attorneys, not to hold office. Do you follow me what's going on here? There's already a resistance to lawyers 20 years or less them to be in office. And it passed and it ratified by most of the states, and it actually became the 13th Amendment until 1812. Now, you got to ask yourself, why did England come? We never got an explanation. I know in history in college, they never gave us an explanation really why the 1812 war took place. Some of it was to do, quote unquote, the United States was something to do with their ships were being harassed by the British, or the United States was harassing the British. I don't quite remember that. That's been probably 40 years ago. But I recall simply that was an incident, and it got worse, and eventually the British attacked. But the interesting part is simply this. They came here basically to destroy paperwork and destroy buildings that were here in Washington. Yeah, that's hard to believe, isn't it? But you got to understand simply is they're not going to allow you to be free. That was the whole idea. The British were subject to the Pope. The British Army, that type of thing, the king was subject to the Pope. There's always someone higher up. So what happened was simply is they came to America in the War of 1812. Didn't last long. And the United States claims victory, although basically what they did simply was that they came to burn down parts of Washington, D.C. and to eliminate the paperwork that there was no lawyers allowed to be, or special people to be in Congress. You didn't know that, did you? Yeah. I would suggest you go to the Missing 13th Amendment. That's not there today. It's not there. You see, they eliminated it. And so I'm putting this together for you to see how little things take place in history, and there's a reason why all of it takes place. So there was a battle also in New Orleans. And this is where Andrew Johnson gets some of his, what's the word? Excuse me a second. Gets his recognition as winning a battle there in New Orleans. So what transpires later? So the United States has got to build those buildings again, and the 13th Amendment is no longer involved. So guess what? Lo and behold, another man comes to power, gets involved. This guy's named Horace Mann. He's considered the father of American education. And Horace Mann is a key figure. You see, we can't let these people get too independent. We have to teach them our story instead of what they think is true. We have to change it. And so Horace Mann was involved in his state. I think it was Massachusetts, as I recall. Maybe it's Connecticut. Don't see it here, but he's considered a great man, and he's not. He's not. So he takes a trip instead of they follow the British educational system, which is basically to learn how to think, how to be able to be cognizant, understand, and rhetoric, understand the classical languages. This is already beginning to be phased out. Well, it never was even introduced in the. I take that back. It probably was introduced at first, but it gradually was weeded out. The only places you would get that simply education would be you studying books at your home, tutor, another possibility, and probably a Catholic parochial school if you lived in a city and you had to be Catholic. There's a possibility that I would assume that the Episcopalians also did that in the South, especially in Virginia and South Carolina, which was heavily at first Episcopalian, Church of England. So, back to my story about Horace Mann, is that Horace Mann is key to all this. And so he discovers that basically he's not going to follow the British system, but he's going to go to Prussia, which is today modern-day Germany. And he likes what they're doing there, and their model is completely opposite. Their model is simply based upon getting the right answer and not understanding how you got that answer, or teaching people to be like a unit, a union, I should say, not for the individual, but for the unity of the whole group. That's what education is all about, is to destroy your independent spirit of who you are. And so that's what he brought back. And they decided they were going to do it in Massachusetts. And they were going to force it upon people. And the people got upset, very upset, and rioted about this action, about having to force their kids to go to school. When most of them, let's just be honest with you folks, most were poor families and just having a little farm. And when they had 2 sons or 3 sons and a daughter or 2, as soon as they got old enough, they were working in the field to help them survive. So you see this belligerent attitude is that we're going to train your child and we're going to teach them our story instead of the truth. And they rioted. And they had a law and they forced it upon people that school was going to be compulsory. Now, I understand how important education is. Look around me. Okay, I got books here. It's important to read. It's important to think. And so, but it was the right of the parents, if they did not want this, they didn't have to force their kids to school. And it wasn't 1 through 12. I know it probably went to, I'm guessing, if I remember correctly, to the 8th grade. Because there wasn't, they basically compromised. And because that age was, you're approximately, 14, 15 years old, and you're a boy, you're needed in the farm to work. And so what transpired is simply this was forced upon the citizens. first in Massachusetts and to mainly the Northeast, and it gradually came south. The South was probably the last part that didn't want it. And so it's important that you understand how these little things take place. And so now they have control of the education. There are still tutors out there. There's still the Catholic parochial school and Episcopal schools, and maybe you can even self-educate yourself. Lysander Spooner, he basically learned to be a lawyer at first, was to self-educate himself and then actually practice with someone in his town to also be educated to be a lawyer. But I don't think he didn't belong to the bar. The bar. Yeah, the bar. It's a group that basically is separate from the rest of us. And a lawyer is one who teaches what I call legalese, or fancy words that most people don't understand and how they twist it. Now, I want to explain something else to you. Lawyers don't work for you. Did you know that? They're loyal to the court system. You do know that also, when you do something wrong, it's against the state. So it's not an individual deal. So you see that we've already have the laws. We're seeing at this early stage. We're already seeing supposedly our freedoms being whittled away. I always point out something that someone is key to me is that, let's just take for example, you have a group of horses or cows, and one is what I would call slavery. The animals are basically kept in a barn, not allowed to get any sun, not allowed to actually be out in the elements and get a bath with the rain, and not allowed to actually do its own business. And so they're the slaves. But slavery is a little bit different than that too. So many people in today's society think they're free, yet they're just basically fenced in, just like an animal. So they're allowed to go outside, but they're not totally free. You see? They're still prevented from roaming all around. It's an analogy I see is that we think we're free when in reality we're not. And it's been set up that way. And so let's go to the next step. And the United States has been a tool for the New World Order since its existence. And gradually they allowed this so-called freedom to take place so that people would really work hard, earn money, believe in the system, so that they would continue to do whatever it took to make America great. And our first war after Britain was a war with Mexico under President Polk, and how we got involved in that. It's the first war that I remember, except the ones took place that were in the Navy in Northern Africa and Tripoli. But this is the first war the United States is involved in, besides the British, with its neighbor, Mexico. That's correct. And it's an army war. It's a land war. It's not dealing with the Navy at all. And this is how gradually, as the industrial revolution takes place later after the war between the states, you can see a slow progress of gradually seeing the freedoms being eroded and that people were no longer free. And the United States became a more and more world power and gradually was involved in all kinds of military affairs. First in its own hemisphere, later on, and then wars now that we do based upon Wilson's foreign policy. We're in a war to give you democracy. We're spreading democracy. When reality simply is democracy means mob rule, and republic means that supposedly you have somewhat a those who represent you are going to vote for you, type of thing. There's another thing that transpired too, but we won't go into that, which is to do with eventually the Senate was actually chosen, the senators from the state. Each state had, 2 senators, and they were chosen by the state House, Senate together. So they were appointed. The only members who voted for were your local officials and your House, U.S. House seat, depending upon your population of the state. So the state would be separated and divided, whatever, and you would have so many such and such. And those who only voted were only landowners. So that meant that slaves didn't vote most of the part, and most poor white people didn't vote neither. That all changes later on also in the late 1800s and early 1900s. So I hope that you will digest this and see how these things have happened. I don't teach a majority view perspective of history. That's not my point, and never will be, because majority is always usually wrong. And also, what we've been taught in school is usually wrong. And I don't know what it is like in other countries, but I do know that my country doesn't teach a true history of what happened in the past. And those who do this know that they brainwash the kids. They don't remember unless they have someone who's learned it in their household, which most didn't. Most couldn't read or write. And so none of that was left in a diary or a book of any type to pass on the legacy.